Picture this: you are crouched in the corner of a cramped stone cell beneath the amphitheater in Rome, 73 BC. Your wrists burn from iron shackles that have rubbed your skin raw. Above your head, 50,000 voices roar like thunder as gladiators clash and die for their entertainment. The smell of blood and sawdust drifts down through the grates, mixing with the stench of fear sweat from 24 other men pressed around you in the darkness. Your name is Marcus, though you were born Cleomenes in Thrace before Roman legions dragged you in chains across half the known world. Tomorrow they will oil your body, hand you a sword you barely know how to hold, and shove you into that killing ground above. But tonight, in this suffocating pit, something extraordinary happens. A gladiator named Spartacus begins to whisper about limits, about lines even Rome cannot cross, about laws written in blood and stone that constrain even the most absolute power over human flesh. You listen, hardly daring to breathe, as he speaks of boundaries you never knew existed in this world, where you are property, where your body belongs to another man as completely as his horse or his wine cup. Yet somewhere in the imperial legal code, carved into bronze tablets and argued in marble courtrooms, are words that say, even slaves have souls that cannot be owned, even property has rights that cannot be stripped away. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The chains that bound 20% of Rome's population were not merely iron, they were woven from law, custom, economics, and the brutal mathematics of empire. Yet even in this system that reduced human beings to livestock, that bought and sold souls in marble marketplaces beneath statues of justice-bearing gods, there existed boundaries, limits, lines that masters, no matter how wealthy or powerful, dared not cross. Understanding these limits requires us to descend into the shadowed world of Roman slavery, not as tourists seeking simple moral lessons, but as archaeologists of suffering, digging through layers of legal papyrus and scarred stone to uncover the complex mechanics of human bondage. What we find there challenges everything we think we know about absolute power and the stubborn persistence of human dignity. Rome in the 1st century BC was a machine for creating slaves. Every conquest fed the beast. When Pompey crushed the pirates of Cilicia in 67 BC, he sold 20,000 captives in the markets of Delos in a single day. When Caesar completed his genocide of Gaul, 1 million Celts died, and another 1 million were chained and shipped to Rome. The city's heartbeat was the rhythm of slave auctions, the crack of overseers' whips, the shuffle of bare feet on marble floors. Walk through any Roman house of substance, and you would find them everywhere, invisible hands that cooked the meals, emptied the chamber pots, copied the manuscripts, taught the children, and warmed the beds. They were the fingers that plaited hair, the backs that carried litters, the minds that calculated accounts. Without slaves, Rome would have starved within a week. Yet even in this economy of human flesh, legal boundaries existed. Roman law, for all its cruelty, was still law, a system of rules that applied even to those who made the rules. Masters who transgressed these boundaries faced consequences that ranged from public shame to criminal prosecution, from financial ruin to exile from the only world that mattered to them. The first and perhaps most surprising limit was this: a Roman master could not legally kill his slave without cause. This was not mercy, this was property law. A slave represented a significant investment, often costing more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Destroying valuable property without justification was wasteful, and waste was a vice that offended Roman sensibilities almost as much as cowardice. More importantly, random killing disrupted social order. If masters could murder slaves on whim, the delicate balance that kept 20% of the population in chains would collapse into chaos. Fear was a tool, but it required precision. Kill too few slaves and they might rebel. Kill too many and you had no one left to do the work. The law developed elaborate categories for justified slave killing. A master could legally execute a slave for theft, for running away, for striking a free person, for sexual impropriety, or for various forms of disobedience. But the killing had to serve a purpose: punishment, deterrence, or the removal of a genuine threat. Casual murder was forbidden. This prohibition was enforced through a complex web of social pressure and legal consequences. Roman society was built on reputation, and a master known for senseless cruelty would find himself isolated from business partnerships, political alliances, and social connections that formed the foundation of elite life. Worse, under certain circumstances, the state could prosecute masters for unjustified killings under laws governing the destruction of property or the disturbance of public order. But the most powerful constraint was economic. Dead slaves produced nothing. A skilled slave, a Greek tutor, a Germanic bodyguard, a Syrian cook, could represent a fortune. Killing such a person was like burning money, and Romans hated nothing more than financial waste. This created a grotesque moral calculus. Slaves lived or died not because Romans valued human life, but because they valued human productivity. A master might hesitate to kill a valuable cook, but think nothing of executing a field hand whose only skill was digging ditches. The law protected property, not people, but since slaves were property, they gained a twisted form of protection from their own commodification. The second major limitation concerned religious practice. Roman religion was a public performance, a civic duty intertwined with loyalty to the state. Slaves were expected to participate in public festivals, to honor the household gods, to observe the sacred calendar that structured Roman life, but they could not be forced to abandon their private devotions or to violate the deepest taboos of their native traditions. This religious tolerance was not born from any notion of spiritual freedom. It was pure pragmatism. Slaves torn from their homelands, separated from their families, stripped of their identities, needed something to cling to for psychological survival. Religion provided that anchor. A slave who retained some connection to his gods, who could whisper prayers in his native tongue, who could observe the festivals of his childhood, was less likely to despair, less likely to rebel, less likely to seek escape in suicide. Masters learned that forcing complete religious conversion often broke slaves in ways that made them useless. A Celtic druid forced to sacrifice to Jupiter might comply outwardly while dying inside, becoming listless and unproductive. A Jewish scribe required to eat pork might choose starvation over pollution. A German warrior compelled to worship Mars instead of Woden might turn his religious fury into murderous rage. So Roman law developed a practical compromise. Slaves had to participate in public religious observances. This was a matter of civic loyalty and social order. They had to honor the household gods of their masters. This was a matter of family solidarity and domestic harmony. But in the privacy of their quarters, in the shadows of their thoughts, they could maintain whatever spiritual connections sustained them. This religious accommodation created strange scenes throughout the empire. In a single Roman household, you might find a Celtic slave girl leaving offerings for the triple goddess in a hidden shrine, a Jewish cook lighting Sabbath candles in the kitchen corner, a Germanic guardsman whispering to Odin before battle practice, and an Egyptian scribe drawing protective hieroglyphs on papyrus scraps, all while publicly participating in the master's worship of the traditional Roman pantheon. Masters who violated this implicit religious freedom faced practical consequences. Slaves driven to religious despair often became useless or dangerous. Some killed themselves rather than live in spiritual pollution. Others turned their religious fervor into violent resistance, viewing their oppression as a cosmic battle between their gods and Rome's. A few escaped and carried tales of religious persecution back to their homelands, making future conquests more difficult and expensive. The third limitation was perhaps the most complex. Masters could not lawfully sell slaves in ways that violated certain social bonds. Roman law recognized that even slaves formed emotional attachments to spouses, to children, to close companions, and that destroying these bonds carelessly could trigger psychological collapse or violent revenge. This was not sentimentality. This was risk management. A slave whose children had been sold to distant provinces, whose wife had been given to another man, whose closest friends had been scattered across the empire, was a slave with nothing left to lose. Such desperation could manifest in suicide, sabotage, murder, or escape attempts that cost masters far more than the profit from breaking up slave families. So Roman law developed guidelines for slave sales that balanced maximum profit with minimum risk. Slave families could be separated, but not capriciously. A master selling a skilled craftsman might be required to include his apprentice son in the sale, ensuring continuity of training and emotional stability for both. A household disposing of a trusted nurse might need to guarantee that her own children would remain nearby, preventing the psychological breakdown that came from complete separation. These protections were limited and often ignored, but they existed. Slave dealers who habitually separated families gained reputations for selling unstable merchandise. Masters who broke up long-established slave relationships without good reason found their remaining slaves increasingly unreliable, fearful that their own bonds might be severed next. The enforcement of these informal protections varied wildly depending on local customs, individual masters, and economic pressures. In times of financial crisis, families were torn apart without hesitation. During military campaigns, emotional bonds were sacrificed for logistical convenience. But in normal circumstances, smart masters understood that preserving certain slave relationships was simply good business. This created a perverse form of family law for the enslaved. Slave marriages had no legal standing, but they had economic value that masters ignored at their peril. Slave children had no inheritance rights, but they represented future investments that were best nurtured in stable environments. Slave friendships had no social recognition, but they formed the emotional networks that kept households functioning smoothly. The fourth major limitation involved torture and mutilation. Roman law permitted masters to torture slaves for information, to punish them for crimes, and to mark them permanently as punishment for running away or other serious offenses. But this violence had to serve specific purposes. It could not be random sadism. Torture was regulated by legal precedent and social custom. It had to be proportional to the suspected crime, conducted with specific goals in mind, and limited to methods that preserved the slave's productive capacity. A master could have a runaway slave branded on the forehead with the letters FUG for fugitivus, but he could not mutilate the slave so severely that he became unable to work. The prohibition on casual torture was enforced through the same mechanisms that limited killing, social pressure, economic consequences, and occasional legal intervention. Masters known for excessive cruelty found themselves ostracized from polite society. Those who damaged valuable slaves faced financial losses that other Romans viewed as evidence of poor judgment and self-control. More subtly, Romans understood that random violence bred random violence in return. A master who tortured slaves for entertainment might find his food poisoned, his house burned, his children endangered by desperate people with nothing left to lose. Controlled violence served as a tool of discipline. Uncontrolled violence was simply dangerous. The legal framework for slave torture was codified in the Digest of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century AD but drawing on centuries of earlier legal precedent. Slaves could be tortured to extract confessions in criminal proceedings, but only under specific circumstances and with particular safeguards. They could be punished physically for violations of household rules, but the punishment had to fit the crime and serve a clear disciplinary purpose. These limitations created a complex moral landscape, where cruelty was regulated rather than prohibited. A master who whipped a slave for stealing bread was within his legal rights. A master who whipped a slave because he enjoyed hearing screams was violating social norms even if he faced no formal punishment. The difference was intent, proportion, and purpose, concepts that offered slaves minimal protection but established important precedents for the limitation of absolute power. The fifth restriction concerned the testimony of slaves in legal proceedings. Roman courts recognized that slaves might be coerced into giving false testimony by their masters, creating a fundamental problem for the administration of justice. If masters could force slaves to lie under oath, then slave testimony became worthless as evidence and dangerous as a tool of legal manipulation. Roman law developed an elaborate system for handling slave testimony that balanced the need for evidence with awareness of coercion. Slaves could testify in court, but their words carried less weight than those of free citizens. More importantly, slaves could only testify against their masters under extraordinary circumstances, typically involving treason, murder, or other crimes that threatened the state itself. This limitation was enforced through both legal procedure and social pressure. Masters who were suspected of coaching slave witnesses found their reputations damaged and their testimony discounted in future proceedings. Courts developed techniques for detecting coach testimony, including separate interrogation of multiple slaves and comparison of their accounts for suspicious similarities. The restriction on slave testimony served multiple purposes. It prevented masters from using slave witnesses to frame their enemies or to escape accountability for their own crimes. It acknowledged that slaves under torture or threat might say anything to end their suffering. Most importantly, it recognized that justice required some degree of independence between witnesses and the parties they testified about. But this protection was limited and contradictory. While slaves could not easily testify against their masters, they could be tortured to extract testimony about their master's enemies. While their words carried less legal weight, they could still be punished severely if their testimony was deemed false or insufficient. The law protected slaves from some forms of exploitation, while exposing them to others. The sixth limitation was economic. Masters could not waste slave labor in ways that damaged the broader economy or violated community standards. This was not a law written in any code. It was a social pressure enforced through ostracism, business boycotts, and political exclusion. Roman society was intensely competitive, with families and individuals constantly vying for status, wealth, and influence. A master who squandered valuable slave labor on frivolous projects, who failed to maintain his slaves' health and productivity, or who used slaves in ways that offended community sensibilities would find himself excluded from the networks of reciprocity that made elite life possible. This economic constraint was particularly important in skilled trades and intellectual work. A master who owned Greek scholars, Syrian physicians, or Gallic metal workers had a social obligation to employ their talents appropriately. Using a trained physician as a field hand or a skilled scribe as a gladiator was seen as wasteful and offensive, like using fine wine to wash floors or burning masterwork sculptures for fuel. The enforcement of this constraint was subtle but powerful. Masters who misused skilled slaves found that other elite Romans refused to lend them money, declined their invitations, excluded them from business partnerships, and spread rumors about their poor judgment and lack of cultivation. In a society where reputation was everything, such social punishment could be devastating. This created an odd form of protection for educated and skilled slaves. Their specialized knowledge gave them value that masters ignored at their peril. A Greek tutor who taught philosophy and rhetoric was too valuable to waste in the mines. A Germanic metal worker who could forge superior weapons was too useful to sacrifice in the arena. A Jewish banker who understood international finance was too profitable to destroy through casual cruelty. But this protection was entirely dependent on economic value and social expectations. Unskilled slaves, field hands, domestic servants, laborers enjoyed no such safeguards. Masters could waste their labor, abuse their bodies, and destroy their lives without facing significant social consequences. The system protected valuable property while offering nothing to those whose only worth lay in their capacity for back-breaking toil. The seventh and perhaps most important limitation was this: masters could not lawfully prevent slaves from earning and keeping small amounts of money through their own labor. This principle, known as the peculium, created a parallel economy within the slave system that offered minimal but crucial opportunities for enslaved people to improve their circumstances. The peculium was property that slaves held with their master's permission, usually money earned through extra work, tips from clients, or profits from small business activities conducted in their spare time. Masters retained legal ownership of this property and could confiscate it at will, but social custom and economic interest usually protected slaves' small accumulations. This system served multiple purposes. It gave slaves an incentive to work harder and behave better, since good conduct could lead to opportunities for earning extra money. It allowed slaves to save toward purchasing their freedom, creating a safety valve that reduced the pressure for rebellion or escape. Most importantly, it acknowledged that slaves were human beings with desires, ambitions, and the capacity for economic activity. The peculium created complex relationships between masters and slaves that went far beyond simple domination. A skilled craftsman might use his peculium to purchase tools that made him more productive, benefiting both himself and his master. A domestic servant might save her tips to buy better clothing, improving her appearance and reflecting positively on the household status. An agricultural slave might invest his earnings in livestock or equipment that increased his value as property. Masters who interfered with the peculium without good reason faced social criticism and practical problems. Other Romans viewed such interference as petty and counterproductive. More importantly, slaves whose small savings were arbitrarily confiscated often became sullen, unproductive, and potentially dangerous. The peculium also created opportunities for freed slaves to help their friends and relatives still in bondage. A freedman might provide loans or gifts that allowed enslaved people to purchase their freedom or improve their working conditions. These networks of mutual aid gave slaves hope for the future and incentives for cooperation in the present. But the peculium was also a tool of control. By allowing slaves to accumulate small amounts of property, masters created the illusion of progress and opportunity while maintaining fundamental power relationships. A slave who had saved half the money needed for his freedom was less likely to rebel than one who saw no hope of escape. The system provided just enough mobility to prevent despair while ensuring that most slaves remained permanently bound. The eighth limitation concerned the treatment of slave children. Roman law recognized that slave children were valuable future property, and masters who damaged them through neglect or abuse were essentially destroying their own investments. More subtly, Romans understood that children who grew up under extreme brutality often became psychologically damaged adults who posed ongoing risks to household safety and productivity. Slave children could not be worked as hard as adults, could not be subjected to the same punishments, and required basic care to ensure their survival to productive age. These protections were minimal. Slave children still faced separation from their parents, sexual exploitation, and preparation for lives of servitude, but they existed as practical constraints on master behavior. The care of slave children was also influenced by Roman cultural values around childhood and family. Romans idealized certain aspects of family life, and households that visibly mistreated children, even slave children, faced social criticism. Masters who were known for cruelty toward the young found their reputations damaged in ways that affected their standing in the community. These protections were inconsistent and often violated, but they represented another boundary on absolute power. A master who worked slave children to death, who failed to provide them with basic nutrition and shelter, or who subjected them to tortures inappropriate for their age, might face consequences ranging from social disapproval to economic losses when his future slaves died before reaching productive age. The ninth constraint was perhaps the most complex. Masters could not violate certain sexual boundaries without facing serious social and legal consequences. Roman sexual culture was built around concepts of honor, status, and appropriate behavior that applied even to relationships between masters and slaves. Roman men were expected to be sexually dominant. They could penetrate anyone of lower status without legal consequences, but they were also expected to maintain certain standards of behavior that reflected their position as heads of households and members of the elite class. Sexual behavior that violated these standards could result in social ostracism, political exclusion, and legal penalties. Masters could legally rape their slaves, but they could not do so in ways that violated broader social norms. Public sexual violence, behavior that offended guests or neighbors, or activities that damaged the master's reputation as a person of proper Roman virtue could lead to serious consequences. Elite Roman men were expected to conduct their sexual lives with discretion and dignity, even when exercising absolute power over enslaved people. More importantly, masters could not force slaves into sexual activities that violated religious taboos or cultural boundaries that Romans themselves respected. A master who forced a Jewish slave to participate in sexual rituals associated with foreign cults, or who required Germanic slaves to engage in behaviors that their warrior culture considered utterly shameful, might face resistance that escalated into violence or suicide. The sexual exploitation of slaves was ubiquitous and largely legal, but it was not entirely unregulated. Masters who were known for particularly degrading or public sexual violence found their social standing damaged. Those who drove valuable slaves to suicide through sexual abuse faced economic losses. Most importantly, sexual behavior that suggested the master lacked self-control or proper Roman virtue could undermine his authority in other areas of life. These sexual constraints were minimal and inconsistently enforced, offering little real protection to enslaved people. But they represented another example of how even absolute power operated within cultural boundaries that could not be crossed without consequences. The 10th and final major limitation was this: masters could not prevent slaves from appealing to higher authorities in cases of extreme abuse. This right of appeal was limited, dangerous to exercise, and often ineffective, but it existed as a final check on the most egregious exercises of private power. Slaves who could demonstrate that their masters had violated legal or social boundaries could appeal to magistrates, governors, or even the emperor himself. These appeals were rarely successful, and slaves who made them risked severe punishment if their claims were rejected. But the possibility of appeal served as a constraint on master behavior and occasionally provided real protection for enslaved people. The right of appeal was most effective in cases involving skilled or valuable slaves whose abuse represented significant economic waste, or in situations where master behavior threatened public order or violated strongly held social norms. A Greek philosopher tortured for teaching unpopular ideas, a Syrian physician prevented from practicing his healing arts, or a Germanic warrior forced to perform sexually degrading acts might find sympathetic ears among Roman officials who valued their services or worried about the broader implications of their mistreatment. These appeals were also more likely to succeed when they involved behavior that offended Roman sensibilities about proper conduct between superiors and inferiors. Romans believed that authority should be exercised with dignity and purpose. Masters who were seen as cruel, capricious, or lacking in self-control undermined the entire system of social hierarchy that Roman elites depended on. But the appeal process was dangerous and uncertain. Slaves who made unsuccessful appeals faced punishment that could include torture, mutilation, or death. Even successful appeals often resulted in the slave being sold to a new master, rather than freed from bondage entirely. The system provided minimal protection while maintaining fundamental power relationships. These 10 limitations on master power created a complex legal and social landscape that constrained the absolute authority that Romans claimed over their human property. None of these boundaries offered real freedom or dignity to enslaved people. All of them were violated regularly with minimal consequences, but collectively they represented something unprecedented in human history, a systematic attempt to regulate the exercise of absolute power over other human beings. The existence of these limitations reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Roman slavery. Romans needed slaves to be property, objects that could be bought, sold, and used without restriction. But they also needed slaves to be human beings, thinking, feeling, productive members of society who could contribute their skills, labor, and intelligence to the Roman project. This contradiction created tensions that could never be fully resolved. Every limitation on master power acknowledged the humanity of enslaved people while simultaneously denying them freedom. Every protection offered to slaves reinforced their status as property while constraining how that property could be used. Every boundary drawn around master authority both challenged and strengthened the system of human bondage. Understanding these limitations helps us grasp the sophisticated mechanisms that allowed Roman slavery to persist for centuries without collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Romans created a system flexible enough to accommodate human needs, while rigid enough to maintain economic exploitation, brutal enough to inspire fear, while restrained enough to prevent constant rebellion. But these limitations also reveal the cracks in the foundation of any system built on the ownership of human beings. Every boundary that protected slaves acknowledged their capacity for suffering, their need for dignity, their irreducible humanity. Every constraint on master power admitted that absolute authority over other people was dangerous, unstable, and ultimately unsustainable. The slaves who crouched in the darkness beneath the amphitheater, listening to Spartacus whisper about limits and boundaries, understood something that their masters preferred to ignore. Power that recognizes its own constraints is power that acknowledges its own illegitimacy. Authority that must be regulated and limited is authority that has already admitted its own moral bankruptcy. When Spartacus and his followers finally broke free from their underground prison, they carried with them not just rage at their oppression, but knowledge of the system's internal contradictions. They understood that Roman slavery survived not because it was absolute, but because it was regulated, not because masters could do anything they wanted, but because they usually chose not to exercise the full extent of their legal authority. This knowledge made the slave rebellion more dangerous than Romans realized. The rebels were not simply angry property striking back at cruel owners. They were human beings who understood the mechanisms of their own oppression and the limitations that constrained it. They knew exactly which boundaries to cross, which rules to break, which constraints to shatter in order to bring the entire system crashing down. The rebellion lasted 2 years and shook the Roman world to its foundations. When it was finally crushed in 71 BC, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to anyone else who might challenge the system. But the warning itself revealed the truth that Romans could never fully suppress. Even absolute power has limits. Even property can rebel. Even slaves can choose death over bondage. Walking past those crosses, seeing the bodies of men who had dared to claim their own humanity, Romans must have understood that their system of regulated brutality was more fragile than they wanted to admit. The limitations that made slavery bearable also made it vulnerable. The constraints that prevented constant rebellion also provided the knowledge necessary for successful resistance. In the end, the boundaries that Roman law placed on master authority were not protections for slaves. They were protections for masters. They were acknowledgments that human beings could not be reduced to property without creating dangers that threatened the entire social order. They were admissions that absolute power was absolutely corrupting, even for those who believed themselves entitled to wield it. The slaves who died on those crosses understood this truth in ways their executioners never could. They had lived within the system of regulated bondage and discovered its fatal flaw. Any power that must be limited has already admitted its own illegitimacy. Any authority that requires boundaries has already acknowledged that those it rules retain the capacity to resist. As you walk away from this story, back into a world where slavery officially ended, but its mechanisms persist in new forms, remember the lesson that Spartacus and his followers learned in the darkness beneath the amphitheater. Power that recognizes limits reveals its own weakness. Authority that accepts boundaries admits its own injustice. And human beings who understand the constraints on their oppression have already taken the first step toward breaking free from their chains. The dust of the arena has settled. The crosses have rotted away, and the Roman Empire has crumbled into history. But the fundamental question remains as urgent today as it was 2,000 years ago. What couldn't owners do to slaves? The answer, then as now, reveals not the mercy of the powerful, but the stubborn, unconquerable dignity of those they tried to own.